When the world fell silent, surviving the zombie apocalypse in a world of the dead ***. The first days of silence ***. Please subscribe my YouTube channel guys, thank you. The world had once been full of noise, car engines, bustling cities, laughter, arguments, the constant hum of life. Now, it was eerily quiet. The streets were empty, the air still. There were no signs of the living, only the remnants of their existence scattered like breadcrumbs across a vast, abandoned landscape. The world had fallen silent. It had all started as a rumor, whispers of a new virus, one more deadly than anything the world had ever seen. At first, it was easy to dismiss. People had heard it all before, the end is near. But then the reports came in from the farthest corners of the earth. Something was happening. People were changing, becoming something else, something unnatural. By the time the world knew for sure, it was already too late. The zombies arrived in waves, moving through cities and towns, tearing through society like an unstoppable tide. It didn't take long for governments to fall, for infrastructure to crumble. The first wave of infection was the most brutal. Cities were overrun in hours. The military tried to fight back, but there was no fighting a horde that didn't tire, didn't fear. They simply consumed. Among the ruins, a small group of survivors had formed. They had found each other by chance, and now, in a world gone mad, they were all they had. Their names were nothing more than whispers to each other, their past lives erased by the terror outside. There was Kira, a former nurse, whose calm presence had kept the others grounded during the first few days. Her eyes had once been filled with the hope of a bright future, but now they were clouded with the weight of loss. Next was Elijah, a mechanic who had managed to keep their small group's vehicles running in the early days of the outbreak. He rarely spoke, but his quick hands had saved them more times than anyone cared to count. Then there was Marcus, the ex-soldier who had been on the front lines when the chaos began. His military training had kept them alive, but it had also made him colder. His trust in humanity had shattered, and with it, any remaining softness in his heart. They had found a safe house in a small town on the outskirts of what used to be a thriving city. The building had been abandoned, but it was sturdy, and it was hidden well enough to avoid the roving packs of zombies that wandered aimlessly through the streets. The roof was high enough to give them a good vantage point, and the windows were barricaded. It was far from perfect, but it was all they had. For the first few days, there was little to do but wait. They huddled together, trying to survive on the rations they'd scavenged from nearby stores. The quiet outside was broken only by the occasional shuffle of zombies dragging their feet, or the distant sound of some terrible, primal scream. Kira was the first to break the silence. Her voice was soft, almost fragile. "We need to move," she said, her eyes scanning the others. "We can't stay here forever. Supplies are running low, and the longer we wait, the harder it will be to leave." Marcus, as always, was the first to speak up. "I don't like the idea of wandering around out there. We don't know what's out there anymore." Elijah was silent, looking out of the window, eyes narrowed in thought. The world had changed, and the only rule that seemed to matter now was survival. But the longer they stayed here, the more desperate they would become. They would need to find a way out. The silence of the world outside was a constant reminder of the chaos that had swallowed it. The streets were no longer a place for the living. Now, they belonged to the dead. And yet, as the days passed, Kira could feel something stirring deep within her. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a void, an endless, oppressive silence that pressed in on them from all sides. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The world had gone silent, but the survivors knew that death was never far behind. The days had begun to blur together. The sun still rose, and the world still turned, but time had lost its meaning. It was hard to remember what had felt like a normal day, before everything had descended into madness. Now, every morning was a reminder that survival was the only thing that mattered. They hadn't moved yet. The safe house, for all its cracks and flaws, had become a temporary refuge, a false sense of security. But the food was dwindling. The fresh water was running low. It wouldn't be long before they would have to face the truth, stay too long, and they would all become easy prey. Kira woke early one morning, the air cold and still. The others were still asleep, wrapped in layers of mismatched blankets. She slipped quietly from her makeshift bed, careful not to disturb them. The roof was her sanctuary now, the one place where she could be alone with her thoughts. The silence up there was suffocating, but it was also strangely comforting. As she stared out over the barren streets, her mind wandered back to the life she had once known. She remembered the smell of coffee in the mornings, the sound of children laughing, the soft hum of her hospital room filled with machines and voices. Now, it was all gone, replaced by the groaning of the undead and the rustling of wind through the broken windows. She had been a nurse. She had saved lives. She had helped bring children into the world, held hands as loved ones passed away. She had been good at it, loved it even. Now, in a world where survival was the only priority, her skills felt useless. There were no patients left to heal. No babies to deliver. No wounds to dress. Just the constant threat of the undead, always lurking just beyond the walls. She didn't realize she was crying until the first tear hit her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, frustrated by her own weakness. She had to stay strong, for them. They depended on her, even if they didn't always say it. Elijah, Marcus, neither of them showed much emotion anymore. But she had seen the way they looked at her, the way they trusted her to lead them, to make decisions. Kira turned away from the edge of the roof, taking a deep breath. It was time to wake the others. They needed to prepare for the journey ahead. If they were going to survive, they would have to take risks. And they couldn't do that if they stayed in one place for too long. When she returned downstairs, Elijah was already awake, quietly sharpening his knife. He barely acknowledged her presence, lost in his own thoughts. She respected that. Elijah had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was usually to give advice that saved lives. "Have you figured out where we're going?" Kira asked softly, standing just behind him. Elijah paused for a moment, considering the question. "We head east. The mountains should offer some shelter. It's a long shot, but we might find supplies along the way. There's a chance, just a chance, that the rest of the world isn't as bad as we think." Kira nodded. She'd thought of the mountains too. It was a place that seemed far enough removed from the chaos of the cities, where nature might still hold some secrets, perhaps some semblance of normalcy. Marcus stirred from his spot on the floor, stretching as he stood. His eyes were sharp, focused, like a predator, always on alert. "What's the plan?" "We leave as soon as we're ready," Kira said. "We can't waste any more time here. We pack light, gather what we can, and head out before the sun gets too high. We need to move fast." Marcus gave a curt nod, his gaze scanning the room for any sign of weakness, any sign that they weren't ready to move forward. He never doubted Kira's judgment, but he didn't trust the world outside these walls. Not anymore. Elijah gathered his things quickly, ensuring his pack was ready. He knew better than anyone that every step forward was a gamble, one they couldn't afford to lose. By the time the sun had reached its peak, the small group was ready. They left the safe house in silence, walking away from the building that had kept them safe for so long. The street outside was empty, but they knew better than to think they were alone. Each step they took brought them closer to the unknown. The world had gone silent, but the echoes of what was lost still lingered in the air, a constant reminder that the dead were never far behind. And in that silence, they could only hope that the journey ahead would lead them to a place where survival was no longer the only thing that mattered. The journey east was harder than Kira had anticipated. The quiet that had once felt suffocating was now oppressive, and the silence outside seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing every sound, every footstep. The once bustling cities they passed through had become ghost towns, with streets choked with the detritus of civilization, crumpled vehicles, shattered windows, rusting remnants of a world that had vanished overnight. Elijah led the way, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. His focus never wavered, and his movements were deliberate, as if the slightest misstep could mean death. Kira had come to rely on him more than she'd expected, trusting his quiet determination to keep them alive. Marcus, on the other hand, walked with a purposeful slowness, his gaze always on the horizon, as if searching for any signs of life, or danger. Kira kept her pace steady, but she could feel the weight of exhaustion in her bones. They had been walking for hours, and though the sun was low in the sky, the journey felt endless. Their water supply was running low, and the food they had scrounged together was only enough for another day or two. The mountains loomed ahead, but they were still days away. She glanced back at Marcus, who had fallen silent once again. His expression was unreadable, his movements rigid. Kira wasn't sure what haunted him more, the constant danger of the undead or the memories of his life before the world had fallen apart. His haunted eyes told her that whatever he had been before the apocalypse, that man no longer existed. "Marcus," she called softly, falling back to walk beside him. "You okay?" He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the empty road ahead. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice flat. "Just keep moving." Kira nodded, not pressing him further. She had learned over time that Marcus didn't talk about his past. Not the way she and Elijah had. He had fought, lost, and moved on. That was the way he dealt with the world now, survive, without looking back. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The air was beginning to chill, the night's cold creeping in quickly. They reached a small cluster of buildings on the outskirts of a town. There were no signs of life here, no movement, no noise, just the wind that rattled the broken windows. "Let's check the town," Kira suggested, glancing at Elijah. "We might find something useful." Elijah nodded and motioned for them to follow. As they crept through the abandoned streets, the silence hung thick. They moved quickly, searching for supplies, but everything was picked clean. The stores had long been looted, the homes emptied of anything valuable. Kira pushed open the door of a small convenience store, her heart sinking as she scanned the empty shelves. There was nothing. The world, it seemed, had nothing left to give. Suddenly, there was a noise, a faint scraping sound, like the dragging of metal across pavement. Kira froze, her breath catching in her throat. Elijah was already motioning for them to fall back. But before they could retreat, a figure appeared in the doorway. It wasn't a zombie. It wasn't even human. The creature standing before them was emaciated, its skin pale and stretched tightly over bone. Its eyes were wide, crazed, bloodshot. It was a survivor, another human, but twisted by the world they now lived in. It hissed at them, a low, guttural sound, before it lunged forward, a makeshift weapon clutched in its hand. Without thinking, Marcus stepped forward, slamming the butt of his rifle into the creature's chest. It staggered back, but it didn't fall. It was relentless, clawing its way toward them. "Elijah, now!" Kira shouted, adrenaline surging through her body. Elijah didn't hesitate. He was already at the creature's side, pulling a sharp knife from his belt. In a flash, he drove it into the man's throat, silencing him with a final, sickening gurgle. The silence returned, even heavier now, as the body of the crazed man collapsed to the ground. Kira's heart pounded in her chest. She had expected danger from the dead, but this was a reminder that the living could be just as dangerous. The world outside had changed, and with it, the rules. Survival wasn't just about avoiding the undead. It was about surviving the other desperate, broken people too. "We need to keep moving," Marcus said, his voice cold again as he wiped the blood from his hands. "This place is not safe." Kira nodded, her thoughts racing. They had to leave, to keep going. The mountains were still their only hope, but now the road ahead felt even more uncertain. The dead weren't the only threat anymore. And that thought, more than anything else, haunted her as they turned away from the town and continued on into the darkening world. The silence around them grew louder. The night had fallen completely now, casting the world into a thick, oppressive blackness. The moon hung high above, barely illuminating the cracked roads they walked on. Kira could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on them, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. They hadn't stopped to rest since the encounter with the crazed survivor. The tension among them had only grown since then. Marcus kept his rifle at the ready, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Elijah, usually a pillar of calm, had grown quieter, his face set in a grim expression. Kira couldn't help but wonder what thoughts were running through his mind. Was he questioning their choices, or was he just as lost in the silence as the rest of them? Every step they took seemed to take them further from the world they once knew, and closer to the unknown horrors that awaited them. The road to the mountains was still long, and with each mile, Kira felt her hope of finding refuge fade just a little more. They were running out of time, and soon, they would be forced to make a choice that none of them wanted to face. Kira turned to Marcus as they reached a fork in the road. "Which way?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid the silence would swallow her words. Marcus paused, his gaze flicking between the two paths. One road led up into the hills, towards the mountains they'd been aiming for. The other veered off into the dense woods, a path that could lead to safety, or disaster. "We go up," Marcus said, his voice low but decisive. "We can't afford to get lost in the woods. The higher ground will give us a better view, and we'll be able to see if anything's coming." Kira nodded, though a knot tightened in her stomach. They had already faced so many dangers, zombies, madmen, the endless silence. But there was something about the mountains that didn't sit right with her. They were still days away, and the closer they got, the more she could feel the world changing around them. The dead were relentless, yes, but the living, they were becoming something else entirely. The climb up the mountain was harder than they expected. The terrain was rocky and steep, and the cold air made their breaths come in ragged gasps. Every step seemed to echo in the quiet night, and Kira felt her nerves on edge, as if they were being watched. Elijah had taken the lead, moving with surprising speed despite the exhaustion that clearly weighed on him. Marcus followed closely behind him, his sharp eyes scanning the path ahead. Kira brought up the rear, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. What if there was nothing at the top? What if the mountains were just another dead end? A rustling sound broke through the night, sharp and sudden, like something shifting in the bushes. Kira's heart jumped into her throat, and she instinctively reached for the weapon she had scavenged, a crowbar she'd found back in the town. "Elijah," she whispered, but her voice caught in her throat. Elijah held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. He motioned for them to crouch down, his eyes scanning the path ahead. They all froze, listening. For a moment, there was nothing. The wind whispered through the trees, the only sound in the world. Then, just as Kira thought it was nothing, there was another rustle. Louder this time. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Kira's pulse quickened as she squinted through the darkness. It was another person, but this one wasn't like the crazed survivor from before. This man, young, disheveled, was walking with purpose, his eyes wild but focused. He was carrying a heavy pack, and on his back, a rifle. "Elijah?" Kira asked, her voice trembling. "Stay down," Elijah growled, his hand firmly gripping the rifle he had taken from the crazed survivor earlier. "He doesn't look like a threat, but we don't know him. Stay quiet." Kira nodded, holding her breath as the figure drew closer. The stranger's eyes darted around nervously, clearly aware that someone, or something, was out there. His gaze briefly met Kira's, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. His face was gaunt, covered in dirt, his eyes dark with exhaustion. There was no mistaking the look of someone who had been through hell. Without a word, the man continued his trek, moving toward the higher ground. Kira exchanged a glance with Marcus and Elijah, who both gave slight, imperceptible nods. There was nothing to do but follow. They moved quietly, careful to keep their distance. The stranger, oblivious to their presence, kept moving up the mountain, his footsteps echoing through the eerie quiet. After what seemed like hours of climbing, they finally reached the summit. As they stepped out into the open, Kira felt a strange chill settle over her. The mountains spread out in all directions, a vast wilderness that seemed both beautiful and foreboding. But there was something else, a sense of unease that gripped her chest. The silence was deafening here. And yet, it wasn't a silence of peace. It was the silence of waiting. At the far edge of the mountain, a small cabin stood, barely visible in the dim light of the moon. The stranger was nowhere in sight. But Kira felt it, a presence, a whisper of something watching them. She didn't know what it was. But she knew one thing. They weren't alone anymore. The cabin loomed before them, barely more than a silhouette against the dark expanse of the mountain. It was a small structure, made of weathered wood that had clearly seen better days. The roof sagged under the weight of time, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. There was no sign of life, no light from inside, no movement. It was as if the building had been abandoned for years. But Kira couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting inside. Elijah was the first to approach, his steps slow and deliberate as he scanned the area. He moved like a shadow, silent and careful, not allowing any hint of his presence to give away their position. Kira and Marcus followed close behind, their eyes fixed on the cabin, their hearts pounding in their chests. "I don't like it," Marcus muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He kept his hand on the rifle slung across his back, his gaze never leaving the darkened windows. "It's too quiet." Kira didn't disagree. The air felt thick, heavy with the same oppressive silence that had clung to them for days. But they were here now, and they had no choice but to check it out. They needed shelter, and if there was a chance this cabin could offer them some reprieve, they had to take it. Elijah reached for the door, pushing it open slowly. The hinges squeaked, the sound sharp in the stillness, making Kira's skin crawl. She held her breath as the door opened wider, revealing a dark, empty interior. The cabin smelled stale, old wood, dust, and something else, something foul, like rot. The floorboards creaked underfoot as they stepped inside, and Kira's eyes adjusted to the darkness. The room was sparsely furnished, a broken chair in one corner, a dusty table in the middle, a few old crates stacked in another. There were no signs of life, no clues about who had been here, or how long it had been abandoned. The silence was suffocating. "Elijah," Kira began, her voice trembling. "What if—" "Shoo," Elijah interrupted, holding up a hand. He stepped deeper into the cabin, his rifle raised in front of him. He was searching, his eyes darting around the room, scanning every corner, every shadow. Suddenly, there was a sound, a faint rustling from the back of the cabin. It was barely audible, but it was enough to make Kira's blood run cold. She glanced at Marcus, who had gone rigid, his eyes locked on the source of the noise. Elijah motioned for them to stay back, and he moved cautiously toward the back room. The tension in the air was thick, and Kira could feel the familiar knot of fear tightening in her stomach. They followed, staying close behind him, their footsteps muffled by the creaking floorboards. The back room was small, the walls covered in mold and grime. In the center of the room was an old mattress, its fabric torn and stained. But it wasn't the mattress that drew their attention, it was the figure slumped against the wall. The man was unconscious, or at least, he appeared to be. His face was gaunt, eyes closed, his clothes filthy and torn. He looked like another survivor, just like the man they had encountered on the road earlier. But there was something different about him. Kira couldn't put her finger on it, but her instinct screamed at her to stay away. "Elijah, wait," Kira whispered urgently, her hand reaching out to stop him. But it was too late. Elijah had already moved forward, crouching beside the man. He checked his pulse, his fingers hovering just above the stranger's neck. "He's alive," Elijah said, his voice low but steady. "Barely. But he's alive." Marcus stepped closer, his gaze scanning the room. "Should we help him?" His tone was skeptical, a hint of reluctance in his words. He didn't trust people easily, not after everything they'd been through. And after what they had encountered on the road, he was even more wary. Kira felt a pang of empathy. She understood Marcus's hesitation, but she also knew that if they didn't help, the man might not survive. There were no guarantees in this world anymore. But they were human, and they had to try, even if it was a risk. "We can't just leave him," Kira said softly, her voice filled with conviction. "He's one of us now. We help him, and maybe he can help us in return." Elijah hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with doubt. But in the end, his loyalty to the group outweighed his reservations. He nodded. "We'll stabilize him," Elijah said. "Then we move out at first light. No matter what happens, we can't stay here long." Kira moved to the stranger's side, carefully lifting his head and placing a water bottle to his lips. He drank thirstily, his hands shaking, but it was a sign of life, a sign that he might pull through. As they worked, the air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier. It wasn't just the silence that made it oppressive, it was the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for them to slip up. Kira couldn't shake the sensation. There was something wrong with this place, something far deeper than just the isolation of the mountains. They were not alone. And as she glanced around the room, she could have sworn she saw movement, just a flicker at the edge of her vision, something lurking just beyond the shadows. But when she turned, the room was empty. The silence remained. And yet, in that silence, Kira knew that they were not safe, not yet. The mountains had not offered refuge. They had only brought them closer to the darkness. The night dragged on in the cabin, stretching long and heavy, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. The fire that Elijah had managed to start flickered weakly in the corner, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The stranger, now semi-conscious, lay on the mattress, breathing shallowly but steady. He had managed a few more sips of water, though his eyes remained glassy, distant. Kira stayed by his side, her fingers lightly brushing his forehead as she checked his temperature, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of unease crawling beneath her skin. There was something about this place, about the stranger, that didn't sit right with her. It was as though the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Marcus sat near the door, his back to the wall, rifle in hand. His eyes never stopped scanning the surroundings. He wasn't just wary of the dark, he was wary of everything. But Elijah, always the calm in the storm, had already begun making preparations for their departure at first light. The last thing they needed was to become complacent. Kira stole a glance at Elijah. He had his back to them, quietly sorting through the supplies they had gathered. He had been uncharacteristically quiet since they arrived. His usual resolve was there, but there was something different, something he wasn't sharing. It was as if he could feel the same thing Kira did, though neither of them had spoken of it. A sudden creak from the back room jolted her from her thoughts. Her breath caught in her throat, and her hand instinctively reached for the crowbar she had discarded beside her. Marcus was already on his feet, the rifle aimed toward the source of the noise, his body tense. "Did you hear that?" Kira whispered, her voice a breath of air. Elijah didn't look up, but his voice came out in a low murmur. "Stay calm. It's probably just the wind, or the house settling." But even as he said it, Kira could see the slight twitch in his shoulders, the same unsettling instinct that told them all the danger wasn't over. Another creak echoed through the cabin, this time louder, closer. "Enough," Marcus snapped, moving toward the back room. "I'll check it out. You two stay here." Kira didn't have time to argue. She held her breath as Marcus approached the back room, his every step cautious but deliberate. The door, still hanging ajar, seemed to pulse in the dim light, as if waiting to be opened. The air in the cabin had become heavier, thicker, as if something was pressing in from all sides. "Marcus," Elijah said sharply. "Watch your back." Marcus didn't respond, but his movements slowed, and Kira could tell he was on edge. The sound of his footsteps was swallowed by the tense silence that enveloped them. When he reached the threshold of the back room, he hesitated, peering inside. A moment passed. And then, in a flash of movement, Marcus was yanked back into the main room with a strangled shout. Kira rushed forward, her pulse racing, but before she could reach him, she saw what had pulled him, saw the flash of a pale, thin figure in the doorway of the back room. The stranger was no longer unconscious. He had risen from the mattress with unnatural speed, his face now twisted into something monstrous, a gaping hole where his mouth had been. His eyes were wide, black as night, staring at Kira with an intensity that froze her in place. The smell of rot clung to him, and his fingers, long, brittle, reached toward her. "Watch out!" Marcus barked, his voice a roar of warning. But it was too late. The stranger, no, thing, lunged at Kira, and in the chaos, she barely had time to react. The crowbar was in her hands before she knew it, and she swung with all her strength, the metal connecting with the thing's skull. It staggered back, letting out a horrifying, guttural screech. The sound wasn't human. It was something else, something far worse. Kira's heart pounded in her chest as the thing reeled, but before she could strike again, it dashed toward the open window, vanishing into the night with an agility that made her blood run cold. It was fast, faster than any zombie she'd encountered. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, their ragged, panicked breaths cutting through the silence. The cabin was still. "Is it gone?" Kira asked, her voice shaking as she glanced at Marcus, who was already checking his rifle, his face pale. "I don't know," he replied, his voice tight. "But I think it was more than just a man. Whatever the hell that thing was, it wasn't just sick. It was changed." Elijah stood motionless in the corner, his eyes flicking from Kira to the window, his jaw tight. "This place, there's something wrong with it. We're not safe here." The words hung in the air like a threat. Kira didn't need any more confirmation. She could feel it, too, the weight of something malevolent in the cabin, something that had been there long before they arrived. Something that had been waiting for them to make the mistake of staying too long. "We leave now," Kira said, her voice hardening with resolve. "Now. No more waiting." They gathered their things in silence, the strange, unnatural fear still hanging heavy in the air. The cabin, once a temporary refuge, had become a tomb in their minds, a trap. The mountains, too, had failed them. There was nowhere left to run. With the stranger, no, the thing, out there somewhere in the dark, Kira knew one thing for certain: the road ahead was the only place they could go, but it would be a road full of shadows. The world, it seemed, had become a far darker place than they could have imagined. And the dead weren't the only danger anymore. As they stepped out into the cold night, the howling wind seemed to carry with it the whispers of the things that hunted in the dark. They were being hunted now. And the silence of the mountains was only the calm before the storm. The world had fallen silent. But the real terror had just begun.